everybody! This is your favorite Foxy writer, Brandy Ackerley. And I am so sorry that this episode is coming out, so late. Let's just say it's been a bit of a pain this week, and leave it at that. Besides, what I really want to talk about is VTubers. We literally had 2 new model debuts, and 5 new Niji-sanji boys debuting last weekend. And I have to say, what I saw impressed me in all of the cases. First, Fofamit's new model came out. It's fully 3D and VR ready, which is awesome, especially since she has a full rig. While I really like this design, especially the futuristic kind of feel it has to it, I have to admit I'm less fond of her hair. That is a personal choice. The scalp is just a little bit higher than I prefer. But I'm not bad-mouthing it in any way. It's an awesome character design, and it really suits her. Regardless of what you think of Fofamit's design, she is one of the experts in the VTubing community, and you should be tuning into her if you're interested in becoming a VTuber at all. The other VTuber who debuted with a new model was Meow Jennycat. Meow Jennycat is one of the sweetest girls I've ever spoken to, and super fun to watch and listen. In addition to that, her new model, it's 2D, it's gorgeous. It has twitching ears and bows that move like when she does. And I will say, a very beautiful, impressive rack that matches the kimono-style outfit for beauty. If you are looking for a comfy VTuber to spend your time with, you cannot go wrong with Meow Jennycat. She is awesome. Lastly, the 5 Niji-sanji boys of Noctix! The first 4 went off without an issue at all, but the last one, Yugo Asuma, had issues with his system, looked like something with OBS, and he had to finish his debut a full day later. Though he was able to fix it in time to hang out with the rest of Noctix and in the after show after the first night. All of these talents are skilled in their own right, and for once, leaves me really unsure about how many I'm going to end up following. There are things I like about all of them. First, let's go to Albin. Albin is our time-traveling thief. Our prince of the comfy vibes. I really like his voice, and I find him interesting with a really cool character design. He also knows how to play to the crowd, which should really help him succeed. Then we have Fulgar Olvid. I'm not sure how long I'm going to keep following him. His deep gravelly voice is really fun, but doesn't really fill a niche. On the other hand, if you're looking for a guy that stays in character, has that dark, moody, emo loner vibe, and of course, is appropriately sarcastic, you can't go wrong with him. I can see him becoming your favorite. He also wants to write a novel about the future he came from, which really endears him to me. That's why I'm on the fence. I'm I like you, but I'm not sure, but you want to write a book? I don't know. He's so wonderful. Uki Violetta is next. There we go. Uki Violetta is the group's resident psychic. Watch out for his singing, everyone. In his debut, he sang a song, and I could not have turned the channel away if I wanted to. His voice is angelic, sweet, and amazing to listen to. Amazing voice. Watch him. I can only imagine that he will be bringing us great things in the music industry. Then we have Yugo. Yugo might be my favorite so far. I wasn't certain if he would be. He has a really interesting accent, and he's so fun to listen to. He definitely made me want to tune in again. It's really good. All in all, the only one I wasn't very fond of was the last boy, Sunny. Sunny Briscoe. Not to say that he's a bad VTuber, he really isn't. He seems exceptionally skilled at voice acting. I can see the constant cop puns that he makes, like, really tickling some people's fancies. That said, it's just not for me. Not for me. My humor is different. He's still great, though. He's still great. If you are interested in voice acting, or just like that type of, like, straight-laced guy in a uniform, this is your man. This is the man for you. They are all so amazing. So, did you see any of these debuts or re-debuts last weekend? What did you think of the Noctix group? Who's your favorite so far? Let me know. Let me know. Now, 2 weeks ago, we left Kazunaha and Richard on a bit of a cliffhanger, and then last week we caught up with Isashi and Hana on their search for our heroes and the deadly monster in the area. Now, on with the story. Here we go. 2 weeks ago, we left Kazunaha and Richard on a bit of a cliffhanger, and then last week we caught up with Isashi and Hana on their search for our heroes and the deadly monster in the area. And now, on with the story. Okay, just let me pull up the book here. Perfect. Richard's breath came in short bursts. How long had it been since the last round of rocks had come crashing down? He couldn't remember, and he was quivering. Part of him was certain that he had to run to escape the death from above. Unfortunately, the rest of him was convinced that if he left the thick table he was hiding under, more rocks would cave in on him. He didn't know what had happened to Kazunaha. He thought he heard her during the collapse, but not since. He had to find out if she was safe. He'd run to the captain's quarters after the mast had fallen. Of all the rooms in the ship, it had taken the least damage. His gamble had paid off when he hadn't died. Light shone through cracks in the roof, a sign of something wrong with the world. He was underground. The idea of sunlight underground was all wrong. He was procrastinating, and he knew it. If he were going to find out if Kazunaha were safe, he'd have to leave the safety of his hiding spot. The idea sent waves of nausea through him. He forced himself to take a single, slow, deep breath. He had a wet cloth wrapped over his mouth, but the air still tasted like dirt. He had to calm down. He had to focus. He forced his mind to Kazunaha. Where could she have gone to escape the rocks? Maybe she was dead. And if she wasn't, she definitely wasn't worth him. Maybe she was dead, and if she wasn't, she definitely wasn't worth putting himself in danger for. He ignored that. Kazunaha was an asset, even if the list of things she couldn't do would fill a book. He liked her. She was a fighter, even if that meant she was often fighting the wrong battles. He'd lost track of her when the roof fell in. She'd been high on the mast when it fell over. It had fallen towards the bow. Had she fallen on the deck or in the water? He took a second deep breath and sprinted out from under the table to the thick doorframe that led to the way outside. Filtered sunlight and the scent of wet everything greeted him, but no more rocks fell, and he relaxed, incrementally, while he looked around. Wet rocks, wet wood, wet dirt. The cave was gone. There was nothing but reddish sky with pink clouds above him. He squinted. The reddish sky must have been due to the dust hovering above the ship. Then he blinked again, noting where the sun was. It was nearly nightfall. Richard grimaced. If he didn't find Kazunaha before the last of the daylight fled, he probably wouldn't find her at all. The monster's corpse lay in the center of the ship, where the mast had been. The slice had done its job thoroughly, piercing thick shell by a good foot, perhaps a foot and a half. Blue-black ichor leaked and pooled from the wound. Despite the rockfall nearly killing him as well, Richard had to admit that bringing the stalactite down had been a good idea. When it had hunkered down with nothing but claws and shells showing, he hadn't been able to hurt the thing with his daggers. He didn't think collapsing the cave had been part of Kuzu's plan. "Kazunaha?" he called out. His voice sounded out of place in the silence. Aside from the sound of lapping water, there was no noise anywhere. He felt the boat rock slightly. The cavern was larger than he judged originally, and the roof had completely fallen in. There was a good 40 feet in every direction, and the water was higher than it had been. The boat was no longer grounded. Richard grit his teeth. Depending on how much damage it had taken, the ship might be sinking, and if he wasn't wrong, the tide would be rising already. He had to find Kazunaha, grab whatever treasure hadn't been lost, and get out of there. Richard ran toward the other end of the boat, where the mast had fallen, smashing its way through the hull. He ducked his head and sighed. Kazunaha's body was there, floating face up. There was a chance she wasn't dead. The water was cooler than it had been, but not ocean cold yet. He swam in, grabbed her, and pulled her back to the hole. He left her floating and pulled himself up onto the deck before he hoisted her up. She was still breathing. He blew out a sigh of relief before he checked for injuries. She was covered with scrapes and nicks and bruises, but only one looked life-threatening. A long gash, nearly the length of her leg, was still bleeding. It was deep. She needed stitches, which meant he needed his kit. It wasn't on him. It should have been in his bag by the treasure. He sighed. Maybe he'd get lucky and it would still be there. Most of their treasure was gone, bucked off the ship during the cave-in, but a few things were left. His bag, the chest of books and coins, and the fireworks. He picked up his bag, glad they hadn't lost the healing supplies. He took everything with him. He wouldn't be able to carry them if he also had to carry Kazunaha, but if she could handle herself some of the way, they could make sure the trip wasn't a total waste. An ear-splitting keen filled the air. Richard rushed back to Kazunaha. She was sitting up, shivering and pale. Her eyes were wild, darting everywhere, probably looking for the monster. He set down the chest and the healing kit and tried to lay her back down. She swung at him and tried to creep away, still keening her hurt to the world. He forced her down and kept her there, one hand on her chest and another on her leg. She moaned, struggling, but seemed too weak to stop him. "My Vina's lost grace, stop it!" he growled. "I know it hurts. Let me help. Kazunaha, stop fighting me!" She seemed to finally recognize him. She sucked in a ragged breath. "Richard? What's—" He didn't move. He couldn't until he could be sure she wouldn't. "You're hurt. You need stitches." She took another ragged breath. Finally, she nodded. Tears ran from her eyes, but she seemed to have found her control. Richard let out a breath. "I'm going to let you go. Stay still." She nodded and sucked in another breath. He slathered her leg with numbing cream first, and strung the flesh needles for stitching. He wanted her distracting. Stitches were easier if you could focus on something else. He smiled as he remembered her doing the same thing for him the first night they'd met, wondering how long he could get away with jokingly saying her name wrong before she caught on that he was doing it deliberately. He shook his head. Nothing would have her laughing right now. "What are you going to do with your share of the money when we get back?" he asked her. "When we get back?" He nodded. She let out another deep breath. A home, I guess. Somewhere away from my sister, maybe a job." She hissed in pain as Richard pushed the needle in. She cut off another scream and gasped. She grabbed Richard and he knocked her hand away. "Stay still, Kazunaha. Keep talking." Her hand found her sword hilt. "My sword. I still have it? Richard, we never figured out how much my sword is worth. 100 gold. Is that enough? I want a home too, but..." He heard her jaw clink as she clenched her teeth. He pulled the string and then grabbed a bit of wood from the deck. Turning towards her, he pushed it between her teeth. He'd heard of men biting their own tongues off by accident, and the first time you got stitches was the worst. This was probably the first time she'd ever actually been hurt. If she wanted to concentrate on the blade right now, he would talk about the blade. Bite down and try not to move. It will help me work faster. She nodded, her eyes wide. Her hand was white and wrapped in a death grip around the sword hilt. She was quivering like a rabbit. He stuck the needle in again, running it under the skin and cinching the wound closed. She flinched and her teeth clamped down on the wood, but he could tell she was trying to stay still for him. 100 gold is probably low. Despite the rust, that sword is still in damn fine condition, considering where it's been for the last 60-some years. He pulled the needle through her skin again, blood welling up and fountaining over his fingers. It isn't rusty, so how much? She wheezed through the wood in her mouth. How much was the sword worth? She had saved his life and nearly killed him. How would each of those figure into the equation? You used it on the rocks, right? I don't think it's made of steel. Some other alloy, maybe? The weapon itself is well made. It was almost certainly done by a master. I assume that's what the symbols on it mean. Maybe 150 gold centime? He silently cursed. That was probably too low. Was his life worth that much? Was she? Names, she confirmed, her voice difficult to understand through the wood. Her breathing hitched as he pulled the needle through again. The name of the sword. It's called Blade of Four Feathers. A named blade. It would probably be worth double what he'd said. Kazunaha's face was bone white, and her gaze was wild. If anyone else had wanted it, he would have insisted they find out the master's name, its age, and gotten it fully appraised before settling on a price. For her, he would take the hit. 150 gold, Kuzu. What do you think? He remembered too late how much she hated the nickname. For now, it was fine. He was half done already. He just had to keep her talking. If that's what it's... She stopped as he stuck the needle in again. Fair! More than fair. Kazunaha was covered in a cold sweat by the time he was done. He poured some seawater over the wound, washing off the dried blood, but her legs swelled against the stitches. He had to get her back to camp before she couldn't walk at all. Kazunaha? Come on, Kuzu. I know you're still with me. She didn't respond to her nickname. That was bad. He kissed her, and finally she focused on him. I'm done now, darling. You did really well there. She forced a smile. This was the worst he'd ever seen her look, but the smile made him feel better about her chances. Let's get you back to the campsite, okay? She nodded, wincing. It took longer than he would have liked getting her up the cliff to dry land, though he found a carved stair by the end of the cavern. He supposed it wasn't a cavern anymore. A lagoon, maybe? Either way, he was now sure that the steps leading up to a small hole filled with dead tree limbs had been a pirate cove at one point, a place to hide the ship behind a waterfall. Kazunaha was shaking by the time they arrived at the campsite, which was still fully intact. He was doubly glad to have it set it up so far away. Richard, what can I do? She asked, while he sat her down. Nothing. You need to rest. Her voice was reed thin, and she was gray. She needed food and rest, in that order. He started the fire again. He had left the soup over top of it, and though it had cooled, it would only take a few minutes to heat. Richard, let me help. I can cook. He glared at her. Or something else? I can't just sit here while you take care of me. He sighed and made sure that the fire was burning steadily. Then he brought the fireworks box over to her. You said you know a way to see if these things are still viable? He waited for a nod from her to continue. Good. See if they are. What do you need? I'll need a tarp, and a wooden stick, or a fork. Where did we leave? He'd be impressed if she'd be able to keep herself awake for another hour. He'd make tea for dinner. He'd brought chamomile. It should relax her enough to let her sleep. Maybe he should add some of the feverfew to it as well. She'd fall asleep easier if the pain was lessened. I'll get you those. Just give me a minute to put on some water. I need tea tonight, not wine. Would you like some? She nodded. Tea would be wonderful. Not that our wine is particularly strong, but I'd rather avoid it all the same. He set the water up and got her the items she requested. Just before dinner was ready, she finished. She opened one of the smaller packages and dumped the contents onto the tarp. It looked like some sort of black, crumbly sand. She was poking at it with the forked stick. She was also having trouble keeping her eyes open, leaning to the side. He didn't think she'd last the meal. How hungry are you? He set the steeping tea in front of her. I'm not. That was bad. She'd lost a lot of blood, too much, and she needed to eat to regain her strength. Her body wouldn't be able to heal or fight any sickness. He poured her a bowl of mostly broth, hoping that it would entice her to have more, the same way his stew had their first day out. She wrinkled her nose. It's been hours since lunch, he said. At the very least, I expect you to drink that and finish your tea. She grumbled, but put the bowl to her mouth to drink some of the broth. He was glad she'd started with the broth. She'd be asleep within minutes of finishing her tea. He ate as well, keeping his ears open. There's too much quiet here, which meant errant noises sounded louder and out of place. They'd have to leave tomorrow. Monsters would arrive to investigate what had happened far sooner than any hunters would, if the sound had carried as far as town. He'd start packing the campsite tonight. They would leave by noon and get a few miles between them and this place before anything showed up. Kazunaha looked ashen, even after eating. He hoped she would have her color back tomorrow. There's still a lot to do, and he didn't want to have to do it all alone. Then again, if he left while she slept? Pain lanced his head, nearly doubling him over. He'd expected some pain to come with the thought, but apparently it was a new low. He couldn't leave a convalescing person to defend themselves in a dangerous place. What if he went to town to get help? The pain eased, but still rumbled deep in his muscles. Kazunaha started bobbing her head, and Richard helped her into the tent. It was the least he could do before he started packing up the camp. And that is it for today. Just let me put the book down here. There we go. There we go. That was a really long chapter. That said, no matter how much I tried to cut it down when I was editing, all of it needed to be in there. I just couldn't find a way to make it less. In the end, just sometimes I have to deal with chapters that don't fit into your preferred totals while you write. It's a bit of a pain, but sometimes you have to go where your story takes you, and accept that even as an author, you're just along for the ride. And like I said, I think that's going to be it for this week. Again, let me know if you watched any of the debuts this weekend, and what you liked about them. Which VTubers you follow in general. All of them were great, just depending on what you like to see, like in your online personalities. As always, if you made it this far in, please consider liking the video, and if you're not already subscribed, please consider subscribing as well. Have a great day, and I will see you next week.